poverty. This is something that, we can all kind of speak to. It's a growing issue here in the United States. And Sean Hannity spoke about it a little bit on Fox News. So let's hear what he had to say.
As the number of your fellow Americans living in poverty has now spiked to levels not seen in nearly half a century. Now, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 50 million Americans are now living in poverty. Now, that's 1 in 6 Americans that are now living below the poverty line. Now, the U.S. has not seen these numbers since the 1960s. Now, that's not all. The report also points out that 20% of the country's children, that's our kids, they're living in poverty, which, of course, is an utter disgrace. Now, even more frightening, the most recent data reveals that more than 47 million people in this country, 47 million, they now need food stamp assistance. Now, to put this number in perspective, the number of Americans on food stamps, that exceeds the entire population of Spain. And nearly half of all the participants in the program are children. That's 20 million kids to be exact. Now, it seems like there's no end in sight.
So Sean Hannity does discuss something that is a growing issue here in the United States. Just to give you some numbers from a recent report, it actually turns out that a huge amount of children here in the U.S. are living in poverty, about 50%. By 2011, almost half of the nation's 50 million public school students, 48% I should say, qualified for free or reduced priced meals. In some states such as Mississippi, that proportion actually rose to 71%, which is huge. 13 states in the South and 4 Western states with the largest populations in 2011 had the high poverty rates among children. A decade earlier, just 4 states reported poor children as a majority of the student population in their public schools. So, this is a really interesting situation because, of course, you have 2 different parties that have 2 different solutions to the issue of poverty. But regardless of what their solutions are, nothing has really been passed to combat this issue. Recently, the House of Representatives did pass a bill that would cut the food stamp program. And I'm wondering whether or not that's really the right way to go about things, considering the number of children that are living in poverty. Michael, the first question goes to you. Have Americans kind of given up on this problem? Have we forgotten about the poor?
No, I don't think that we've forgotten about the poor, but I think over the last 40, 50 years, our views on the causes of poverty have shifted in ways that don't make it very possible for effective policy making to take place. During the War on Poverty in the 1960s, from the General Social Survey, we had pretty clear evidence that most people thought that poverty was a cause from structural factors in the economy, having to do with limited opportunity. That's opposed to the view that I think dominates now, where individuals are held at fault for their own poverty status, either because of the poor choices that they've made or from individual behavior and things like that. And if you look at the General Social Survey, you see that Americans have become much more conservative in their view with regard to conservatism. And I think that's translated into what causes poverty. So the idea that effective government policy making, for example, in jobs programs or other kinds of stimulative efforts that would grow the economy, which has been the, I think, biggest policy that we could have to lower poverty, that doesn't have the same kind of political support, and so it's much more difficult to, I think, address and solve poverty effectively.
Now, Paul, you're on the opposite end of the spectrum. You have Democrats that would advocate for social programs, more funding for public education to ensure that young children have the same opportunities as wealthy children to make something of themselves. But at the same time, you have the Republican Party or conservatives who are advocating for cuts to these social services. I mean, where do you stand on that issue?
Well, I think there's really 2 schools of thought on it. First off, I am a conservative Republican, maybe the only one on the panel, I don't know. But, I grew up poor. I grew up on a dirt road in a house without central air or heat. We could have easily qualified for food stamps, and we didn't. My single parent, my mom, worked the best that she could. And I've been in law enforcement for 17 years, so I've worked in communities. God bless kids. We've got to focus on kids. That's got to be a focus. But I've also seen an entitlement mentality in this country since I've been a kid to now, that really just expects a handout. And these aren't the kids that are the problem. Oftentimes it's the parents or a generational welfare feeling that we're seeing. So we've got to address 2 problems. We can't leave our kids behind, but we also can't let families just continue the entitlement expectation that welfare is a way of life. We want people to get jobs and work. And there was a good work program that I think we had when the Democrats and Republicans worked on this together with Clinton. And I think we've stepped away from that, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, at the same time, though, during the Clinton administration, he increased taxes in 1993 for the top 1% to 39%, which is unheard of right now. And those are the same taxes that helped fund public education, which gave young people the opportunities that allowed them to do better in life. So, what would your response be to that? Because right now, the current conservative Republican Party refuses to increase the taxes to create these opportunities for, the most impoverished people in the country.
Yeah, I don't think we can spend our way out of poverty. I think what we need to have is a better education campaign throughout the communities. Look, people don't, I think raising taxes is the wrong approach. I think we're punishing people like myself who worked out of poverty to become successful, who then want to help our communities. I think there's a lot of underlying problems that affect poverty, including crime, gangs, and drugs. We need to look at the base problems right now that I think are out of control in this country that clearly we're, I think, ignoring. We could say we've got a war on poverty, we've got a war on crime, we've got a war on gangs. We're never going to eliminate poverty, but I think we should all be startled at the fact today that we're living in a country where poverty is at levels that I don't think any of us have seen in our generation. It is a massive problem, but I don't think we're talking about it correctly politically.
But that's not exactly true. I mean, poverty is a little bit elevated because of the reverberation of the Great Recession. It's currently about 15%. But during the 1990s, it was at 11%, which over the last 50 years was at its lowest period. And the reason why it was the lowest period is because we pursue growth policies, expansionary fiscal and monetary policy that grew the economy like we've never seen before since the oil embargo in 1973. That had the biggest poverty-reducing effect that we've seen since the 1960s. So expansionary fiscal policy, raising tax rates for the rich, that occurred during one of the biggest growth periods, being able to invest in human capital and other kinds of smart industrial policies, I think is the most effective. But let me also note that poverty rates were highest in 1960, 22%. It was after the War on Poverty programs when we instituted things like food stamps, child care credits, and other kinds of assistance programs that we see poverty decline by its largest amount, 7 points in that 7-year period. And in fact, if you were to count some of the subsidies that are given by government programs, some of which are very effective, like preschool programs, if we were to count those in the income column, poverty numbers would be reduced by about 4 percentage points. So these programs are effective. Some of them could be tweaked and made more effective, but they certainly have had the intended effects that policymakers wanted.
Just a really interesting number before we go to Desi. During the Clinton administration, after he increased taxes, a lot of times, the Republicans would make the same arguments that the Republicans are making today, that if you increase taxes on the wealthiest people in the country, they're unlikely to create new jobs. Well, during that tax hike, we actually increased jobs by 22.7 million. So it's really interesting that they talk about high taxes hindering economic growth, but that's actually not what really happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, the economic data is very clear over the last 60, 70 years that when you do raise the tax rates on the top 1% or the top 1% of the top 1%, that it does tend to lead toward more economic growth and more economic growth policies rather than the Bush administration tax cuts, which I think have proven that there is no link between tax cuts and job creation, only with raising taxes to perhaps the Clinton rates, which weren't even the highest rates that we've had. They were much higher during the Eisenhower years. If we went back to the Clinton tax rates, I think we would see that influx of investment that is kind of required to pull people out of poverty. And also, bringing in what you've talked about as well, about education. Poverty is the single largest predictor of educational outcomes in the United States. And if we are able to invest more in our education, but that requires money, and money to the public school system, that also has other issues involved as well. Children in poverty don't just show up and are ready to learn. They also need other assistance beyond that. So, we've got a lot of big, deep, tectonic plate moving parts going on here with the increase in poverty since the Great Recession. Education, I think, is probably the place that we could focus the most, that I think most people could agree on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way education could be funded is also a really hot topic of debate. Just to give you an example, right now, only 10% of the funding for our public schools comes from the federal government. The rest comes from local government. And it's a little problematic because they use property taxes to fund public education. If you are a student living in a poor area, you are not going to have the same resources in your public school that a rich student would have or a wealthier student would have. So I think the way that we fund education is also problematic. And Paul, you mentioned how you grew up in poverty. I grew up pretty poor too. I'm the child of 2 immigrants. We didn't have much growing up. And my dad was doing everything he could to pay off an apartment building that he had bought. And I remember that, the way things worked out for me was that I had certain opportunities that kids don't have these days. When I went to college, for instance, I got a full scholarship. That doesn't happen anymore. Education has become so expensive that the majority of students that graduate have a tremendous amount of student loan debt, and they essentially become indentured servants for the rest of their lives because they can't pay that off. So you and I had some opportunities that the current generations do not have, and I think that that's a little problematic. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think we've priced out education. I think the cost of college today is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've got a master's, a bachelor's, and a doctorate, and you look at the student loan debt that I had. So I think we put a lot of emphasis on college, but I think we don't put enough emphasis on the trade, on the skills. Even though I'm highly educated, I don't think we need to be pushing college. We need to be pushing people into careers where they can be successful. That doesn't necessarily mean that college is the end state for that. So, but I think the other issue that we haven't talked about that really affects kids is we have a lot of broken homes in this country. We have a lot of kids growing up with single parents. We've got a lot of single parents who are working 2-3 jobs. There's very little responsibility for the child when they go home. Unfortunately, we have more gang members on our streets here in the U.S. than we do police officers. And if kids don't have supervision when they go home, who becomes their parent? It's the community. And unfortunately, especially here in Los Angeles, you look at the communities that are just decimated with gangs and drugs. So there are some underlying problems here, and I don't think we can get to the big ones until we look at why family values are crumbling across the country. And I think that is a core conversation to have.
So how would you propose that we deal with the issue of family values? How do you, the family structure has changed significantly in the country. The divorce rate is extremely high, right. And there are a ton of tax incentives for people to get married and remain married.
Sure.
So how much more of an incentive can we give them, and how do we solve that problem?
I don't know if it's even an incentive. I just think over generations we've become just desensitized over time to things that were not acceptable at one point and are acceptable today. And I think we just keep chipping away at the morals and values of a community. I look at it from being on the streets in law enforcement, or we run anti-drug coalitions trying to keep kids off of drugs. You look at how many parents today show up to a PTA meeting out of a school with thousands of kids. You get 5 parents showing up. There's big concerns there. I think we need to put more responsibility and onus on the parent or parents to take responsibility for their children. It begins at home. And I think homes are broken today, and I think a lot of parents are to blame for their kids growing up the way that they do.
See, I would approach it from a different place. I would say that we have, say, a whole segment of society that is not getting the support and the education that they need, whether it's parenting classes, whether it's making a living wage so that they don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs, so that they can show up to the PTA meeting instead of working the night shift at McDonald's. They have other options and other training and other job opportunities that are simply not there. I mean, you cannot support a family of 4 as a single mom with 1, 2, or 3 kids. If you're a single mom, you cannot support a family on a minimum wage salary.
If I could just add on, and that's where my heart goes out, it's really the single parents that are working their tails off. My mom did that. I mean,
my mom did too.
You watch these parents, but my mom raised me on good values and morals, kept me out of gangs, kept me off of drugs, talking about what was right and wrong. Today we have too many parents that say, not my kid. My kid doesn't have that problem. I can't tell you the times that law enforcement takes a kid home who's on the streets, and the parents are upset at the cops for taking the kid home when the cop's just trying to do the right job. I think too many parents today are really part of the problem rather than part of the solution, because we're not having this honest discussion about what's happening in the home.
And what would be an effective way to deal with that? That's, I think, where we are. What would be the effective thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, we could have this discussion too. I mean, single parent is a factor of many things, including, I think, increasing empowerment of women to make choices about whom they should be with and whether or not it's actually good for them and their family. So there's a lot of different factors. But I wanted to come back to your point on this school equalization question that you were saying, because actually in many states, when there is unequalized funding as a result of differences in property values, provide schools with that delta or that gap to equalize funding. But I think California, is at the head of the curve because they get it right. Is it just to take kids who come from very different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds and give them equal funding and expect equal outcomes in schooling? And I think the answer to that question is no, that in some certain circumstances, you have to give kids in more disadvantaged neighborhoods and more disadvantaged schools more money, because you have a lot more headwinds and challenges to address to get to the point where you could focus on learning. And I think that is the central question for us too. But I also want to note that, you know, a lot of the talk about gangs and crime and all that is somewhat exaggerated too. I mean, over the last 20 years, crime rates have fallen, and especially some of these hard hit neighborhoods. Violent crime rates out there are all-time low. Gang membership per 100 youth joining gangs has fallen, you know, to radical new lows, and part of that has to do with policy. Part of it has to do with smart community policing by police. But a lot of it, but the social conditions have still remained the same. Yet these outcomes are improving. High school graduation rates are up. School attendance are up in a lot of these different kinds of communities, in part because we've been doing smart policy, and we're not just leaving it to individuals to make their own choices.
Yeah, and you know, to Paul's point about drug use, you know, drug use is definitely a problem, and we've been using a tremendous amount of funding for this war on drugs, which has not been successful. So we kind of have to prioritize where our funding should go.